about, move to looking at single species now and talk about rarity and attributes of rarity, classifying threatened species. Then move on to look at vulnerability to extinction and then the current extinction crisis. Okay, so in terms of what we've been talking about so far, we've been looking at species richness, and we looked at those indices that look at relative abundance. We're now really just turning to singular species. Is it normal for a species to be rare? Yes, it's completely normal, where ecologists have looked at relative abundance. There's some examples here. This is plant species in a desert in America, and this is birds in a forest somewhere in America, looking at measures of abundance and plotting that on a log scale. Where you have a large number of species like this, what you often see on a log scale is a kind of a normal distribution. So you have a large number of species in the middle and their abundances are sort of moderate. You have a small tail at one end with a few species where they have very low abundance or density or coverage, depending on what you're measuring, and a few species that are very highly abundant. And obviously that changes. We saw that reptile example before where there was a long tail of quite rare species. It might change from community to community, but many communities with a large number of species where there's lots of different factors that are acting on those populations will have a log normal distribution. And what those distributions tell us is that it's normal to be rare. It's quite common to be rare, in fact. And so it's not necessarily in and of itself something to worry about for a species. Top predators, for example, like the tiger, are always going to be rare in terms of having low densities because they need large home ranges to satisfy their prey needs. So that's part of their ecology. It's a normal ecological phenomenon to be rare. But what we want to move towards is how do we distinguish kind of rarity like that from rarity that we need to be concerned about. And one of the things that we need to know is that we don't just look at abundance, there are other components of rarity. There are two others. So we can look also at geographic range and how extensive or restrictive that geographic range or distribution is for a species. We might also look at habitat tolerance or specificity. Does it have a broad habitat tolerance? If it's a plant, can it grow in a whole range of different soil types? Is it associated with a whole range of different plant and vegetation communities, or is it very specific in its needs about where it can grow? And then we also might include abundance as well. So three things: distribution, specificity, and population size. So having a small range, being very habitat specific, being specialised, and having a small population size, they would all be attributes of rarity, and a species would then have all three attributes. So it would be sitting in the middle of that Venn diagram there. Some species could just have two different attributes of rarity, and some species might only have one, or in fact, even none. So this is our classification system for rarity. There are 7 forms of rarity, 7 combinations that you can have as a species of each of those different attributes, and one way of being common, having none of those attributes. This is a system that was put together by a botanist in the UK when she was looking at her plant data from across the islands. And it's kind of stuck because it's very useful. You can see down the bottom here, number 1, so having a small abundance everywhere within your distribution, small population size, being very specialised, and having a restricted distribution. That makes you as a species extremely rare. And so where we would see all 3 of those attributes, that's where we're getting quite concerned. Obviously that species needs some kind of immediate attention or immediate action. One of the things obviously that we might like to do is to work on abundance and distribution. They're things that we can work on. We can extend the range of a species if we can have a successful translocation. We can put in place habitat protection. We might be able to put in place some measures that help that species to increase its population size. Unfortunately, there's not very much we can do if they have very specific needs. We can't change their biology, but we can do something about these other things. Number 2 here is your classic endemic species. Has a very restricted distribution by definition. And the reason often that it has that restricted distribution is because it can only live in that place under those conditions. So it's specialised. But often, endemics will have large populations. They're very abundant where they are present because it's a fantastic place for them. It's got the perfect conditions. So that's our classic endemic species right there. And that species, or in fact any species with a restricted distribution, needs to have some kind of thought around habitat protection. Because as someone mentioned earlier, if you've only got one or a few populations in a relatively small area, then that leaves you open as a species to some kind of environmental disaster coming out and wiping out your populations, wiping out your range. This has become a reality for many species after the recent bushfires that we've had across the country. So this is information that's come out from the vets, from the Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment. And they've had a look at species on the threatened list and at some other species as well, and they've looked to overlap the range, the distribution ranges for those species and the extent of the bushfires in the eastern states and across the south of Australia, also including southwest WA as well. And they've recently released a list of 113 animal species that they think, based on these overlaps and some other assessments of their biology and ecology, that require urgent management intervention following those fires. And that's the breakdown of the taxa there. So these are the ones that they've identified have had at least 10%, and in many cases, well, they're saying at least 30% here, in many cases much more than that of their range that has been taken out by those severe bushfires that we've had. So this isn't just sort of a pie in the sky thing, this is actually a reality now for a large number of species in Australia that have had a restricted distribution, and they may not even have been threatened before that, but that one big environmental disaster on such a large scale has gone through and wiped out large portions of their distributions. Now that's preliminary information. All they've done is done a map overlay on a desktop. They haven't yet, in many cases, gone out to assess species on the ground. So they might get out there, and for the Wollemi pine, for example, that area was protected. So they are actually fully protected, even though on the map it shows that there were fires in that area. So there needs to be some on-the-ground assessments, but it's pretty bad news for our biodiversity following bushfires in Australia. So back to our table. So you can have 2 attributes of rarity and be very rare. You can just have one and be rare, or probably best case scenario to have none of those and to be a common species. But they're also not entirely safe, and we'll touch on that a bit later on. Okay, so those 3 things, how can we actually quantify those? So how would we go about measuring or calculating population abundance? Just call out some ideas. Plants, animals, doesn't matter. How do we do that?
Just like plotting an area and measuring the...
Sorry, can you put your hand up? I can't see where you are. Up back.
Plotting an area and measuring the amount of...
Yeah. Yeah, you could do that
for...
plot-based sampling. You can do it for plants, you can do it for some animals. Yeah. Doing sampling counts? Sure. Other methods?
Capture and recapture.
Capture and recapture, yes, works very well for animals. Gives you a good estimate of population size. Yeah, okay, so we can actually go out, put the effort in and collect that information and get an answer for that. So it's not something we can't estimate. What about habitat specificity? How would we do that?
By measuring distribution.
Yeah, looking at distribution, where do they actually occur and what are the attributes of those habitats in which they occur? Absolutely. You can do experiments for plants, you can test a range of different nutrient soil types, shade, sun, those kinds of things. For animals, it'd be harder to do experiments, but you can look at distributions, you can look at specific variables of areas where animals are present versus areas that are available to them and see if there's a difference between the ones that they choose and the ones that are out there as their options. Information on geographic range is available as well, and sometimes, often, when we look in a taxonomic guide or a field guide, you sort of just see this blob on the map. Usually that's what is called an extent of occurrence. So they will have plotted out all of the known museum specimens or samples of a species or the known populations and plotted those on a map and then drawn a line around the edge of that, and that would be the extent of occurrence of that species. There is a finer scale way of doing that called area of occupancy. So you could overlay a grid on your map and then look to see whether the species occurs in each of those grid cells. And so then you're excluding areas within that extent of occurrence where the actual species doesn't occur or where there's unsuitable habitat. So obviously it would be great if we could do this approach and then go to every grid cell and sample for the species, but that's obviously not normally what happens. It's not the information that's available. So we have to go with, when we're assessing rarity and using it for categorising threatened species, we have to go with the level of information that's available, which sometimes is a little bit fuzzy. So let's take some examples. Having one attribute of rarity. The superb lyrebird is a good example of this. It has always had a restricted distribution, although not really restricted. It has populations in southeast Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria. It's also been introduced into Tasmania. And it occurs not very far inland, but from sort of coastal areas right up into the mountainous areas on the east coast. But it's endemic to that region, so it occurs nowhere else. So on that basis, it has one attribute of rarity. And it does prefer to live in wet forests and rainforests, but it can extend its distribution into drier forests as well, and it does, particularly when they're in good conditions. And it's not particularly fussy about what it eats either. It's a ground-dwelling bird. It can't fly very well. It forages around on the ground for invertebrates in the soil, so it's not very habitat specific. So it's pretty common in that sense. And it has decent, healthy population sizes. And you might have seen, so this is the male, the tails are more elaborate on the male, but you might have seen that they do courtship displays, the males. So they spread out their tail, they actually do a dance, and they make these fantastic songs, and they mimic. They're well known for mimicking. So when you listen to recordings of the lyrebird, you'll hear some of their own song, but then kookaburra and magpie and cockatoo, and they're very, very clever in their mimicry with their song. So, all good, not endangered, supposedly stable. We're not expecting them to be impacted by fire because they live in wet forests, and yet in the recent fires it's estimated that that's wiped out about 50% of the lyrebird's habitat. So in that one large event, they're now looking to see whether or not this species might need to be listed as a result. Having two attributes of rarity. So this is the Haleakala silver sword, lives on one volcano on one island in Hawaii. So it has a restricted distribution and it's highly specialised. It can only grow in the volcanic rock and cinder that's on that volcano. But it's locally very common, has a population of 65,000 or something. It has been endangered, but when they put habitat protection in place, then the population numbers increased. This is the plant here. It has a basal rosette of leaves, lives for about 15 to 20 years, and then it produces this beautiful flower head, sets seed, and then dies. Another classic endemic with two attributes of rarity is the honey possum, one of my favourite little animals, so much so that I did my PhD work on these guys. They have a restricted distribution to the southwest of WA, where they live in that Quongan heathland and Banksia woodland, and it's probably the only place in the world that they can actually survive because they are very specialised for feeding on nectar and pollen, and they're so well adapted to feeding on nectar and pollen that they couldn't even crunch up an insect if they wanted to. Their skeleton and their bite force is not large enough basically to chomp down on an insect. So the plant diversity in the southwest offers them a year-round food source. And they have all these amazing adaptations. They've got a really long snout, they're only about this big, plus a tail. They poke that down into the flowers, they stick out their really long tongue, which is covered in hairs. They collect the nectar up through capillary action into those hairs on their tongue. And then on the roof of their mouth is a comb. And as they bring their tongue back into their mouth, that combs off the pollen grains that they can then ingest. And they're very light, they've got tiny little pegs for teeth, and they can clamber around on the ends of branches and on flowers like this one, and they basically pull the flower towards them like they're kind of licking an ice cream. Again, as an endemic, they're locally very abundant. They're probably the most abundant mammal in Western Australia. It's just that you don't actually ever see them when you walk out into the bush. Obviously, living in the habitat that they do, that can be affected by dieback, so it doesn't mean that they're without threat. Three attributes of rarity. Poor old Gilbert's potteroo. A species that was thought to be extinct and then was rediscovered in Two People's Bay down near Albany in the 90s. And there was a population of around 40 individuals down there. They've now translocated it to two different islands, and so there's a few more, maybe 70 individuals in total. So it's got a very restricted distribution. It was always restricted to the southwest of WA, and it's highly specialised. Likes to be in dense undergrowth for protection, and it's probably one of the most mycophagous animals that there is in the world. Its diet consists of 90% fungal truffles that it digs up from underneath the ground. And that's one of the reasons when they first discovered the populations, they tried to do some captive breeding, but it's one of the reasons why the captive breeding wasn't successful, because they just couldn't sustain them with the diet that they needed in order to breed. And another one with three attributes of rarity, Acacia auwestonia, Stirling Range wattle, only lives in Stirling Ranges, or at least we hope it still occurs there, in a few small populations of definitely less than 1,000 individuals, probably more like hundreds. I'm saying it's specialised. I guess that's on the basis that at the moment it only grows in particular soil types and with particular associations to wandoo trees. It was listed as vulnerable. It's a species, again, that has been impacted by the fires. So in the Stirling Ranges fire over summer, that took out about 80% of the distribution of this plant. So there are grave concerns for this species at present. So rarity is normal. Rare species are not necessarily endangered. Of the species that we looked at, the lyrebird wasn't before, the honey possum wasn't, the silver sword is not. It's listed as vulnerable, not endangered. So being rare doesn't necessarily mean that you're endangered or threatened. But it does, of course, leave you open as a species to environmental disasters like fires, for example. So it exposes you to some level of threat, but it's not a foregone conclusion. So does being rare make species vulnerable to extinction? Yes, I think we'd have to say it does. Think about in the case of the lyrebird example, where it goes from being quite a common, reasonably restricted distribution, but many populations, through to potentially being listed as threatened in one foul swoop. And this is just to show you some of that data of those 113 animal species, and many of them are threatened, but many of them that have had their distribution severely impacted were not listed prior to those bushfires. So how do we convert those attributes of rarity to help us categorise threatened species? Well, this is the IUCN, this is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. This is the international system under which species are categorised. And these are their categories here: extinct, extinct in the wild, and then the 3 levels of threat: critically endangered, endangered and vulnerable. Then there's near threatened. Least concern means they've been evaluated but they don't qualify to be listed as endangered, critically endangered or vulnerable. And then there's data deficient. Data deficient is an important issue because, like the Gilbert's potteroo, there's a range of different species that were thought to be extinct and then have been rediscovered just in Australia alone. Okay, so how do we take those attributes of rarity and use those to slot species into those threatened categories? And this is how it's done. Again, you don't need to remember the details here. You can go to the IUCN website and get the document that gives you all of this information. And I think there's a summary of it in the pre-map textbook as well. So basically, a species needs to meet any of the following criteria: A, B, C, D or E. And you'll see that these are around those attributes of rarity, around population size and distribution. And there are different thresholds to whether a species is categorised as critically endangered, endangered or vulnerable. So if there's a greater than 90% reduction in population size over 10 years, or there are lower thresholds if the reduction is ongoing, then it can be categorised as critically endangered. 70% for endangered or 50% for vulnerable. It can have a small range. Again, there are varying thresholds. It can have a small and still declining population, or just a very small population. So you can see how the Gilbert's potteroo fits into this category here. There can be a quantitative analysis done, so a population viability analysis which takes into account size and demographics and other information of the species, and it does a statistical modelling to look at extinction risk over a period of time. So a greater than 50% chance of becoming extinct in 10 years gets a species listed as critically endangered. And so that's the international system. We also have our federal system through the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. And we also have our Western Australian level of classification under the Biodiversity Conservation Act, and both of those use IUCN-like categories and criteria to classify species into those. And also ecological communities can be listed, as I mentioned. The latest listing that's come out from 2018 shows that there are 249 animals and 429 plants listed as either critically endangered, endangered or vulnerable in Western Australia alone. So the list is quite heavy. And again, I just wanted to show you some more of this info that's come out from the federal government department about the recent bushfires. And this is looking not just at animals but at plants as well. And just looking at threatened species lists. And you can see here that they've classified them according to the percentage of their distribution that's been wiped out by the fires. And the numbers in there are just staggering. 49 listed threatened species have had 80% of their habitat removed in these bushfires. So, some scary stuff in there. Alright, okay, I wanted to move on now to look at what makes species vulnerable to extinction. Obviously, we've discussed the fact that having some aspect of rarity makes them vulnerable, but we want to look at other factors as well now around their biology. This is relatively old data now from the IUCN showing different taxa and species within those that are listed as threatened in any of those three categories, and looking at what the threats are to those species. And you can see that habitat loss and degradation features well for all of those taxa. Exploitation for mammals and birds is a big one. Invasive species is very important for birds, particularly where they live on islands and they've evolved to become flightless over time because there have been no predators, and then predators come in. Think about the dodo on Mauritius. So that's an important threat for birds. Pollution, quite important for amphibians. And then they list this thing called intrinsic factors. And that's where our focus is going to be for now. So there are external threatening processes, and then there are these inherent characteristics, something about the biology of the species, which might mean that it makes them rare, have one of those attributes of rarity, and predisposes them to extinction. So when we look to see what these factors are, these intrinsic factors, what researchers do is they look for biological correlates of threatened species or species that have become extinct. So they look at those species and they say, what do they all have in common that tells us why they may have become extinct or why they might be on the threatened species list? One of those things is limited dispersal. So obviously this feeds into that attribute of rarity around restricted distribution. So this is data, fossil data of bivalves and gastropods off the North American shelf. And it's looking at persistence of those species in the last 16 million years of the Cretaceous. So when, at the end of that is when the dinosaurs became extinct, so around 65 million years ago. And so it's looked at the percentage of species surviving, and it's categorised them according to their geographic range. And you can see ones that have a more extensive geographic range persist for much longer than those that have a very restricted geographic range. And the ones that have a more extensive geographic range were the species that have larval stages where they go out and become part of the plankton and they drift around, and so they have high dispersal abilities. The ones with more restricted distributions were the ones that developed directly from the egg. So if they're able to float about in the plankton and increase their dispersal, this allows them to colonise a larger range and means that it gives them some buffer from extinction threats. So if there's some kind of local disease or there's a predator event in a local population, then it's got buffer populations from which it can survive. Body size also comes out as a really important correlate of extinction risk. And there's increasing evidence for mammals that this is really important. There was a large study done with about 4,000 mammal species that they looked at, and they compared those on the threatened species list with those that were not threatened, and they found a difference in size by an order of magnitude. And what they also found was that there were some other attributes of those species that were also correlated with extinction risk. So species with lower population densities and lower reproductive rates had a higher risk of extinction, or higher rates of threat, if you like. Having an association with humans was also gives you a higher extinction risk, and that means close proximity to high human population density. And all of those things, those threats became stronger as the species became larger. So over about 3 kilos is where these intrinsic factors start to become really important. And often it's the larger species that do have the lower population densities and the low reproductive rates as well. In Australia, it's somewhat a different story. It's a little bit more complex. In Australia, you'll hear people talk about this critical weight range, which is mammals that sit between about 100 grams to around 5 kilos. And those in the critical weight range are the ones that have the highest extinction risk and feature heavily on the threatened species lists. But that only holds if they are ground dwelling, so not arboreal species, and if they live in semi-arid and arid zones of Australia. And that's because in those zones, resources are low, they have naturally low density populations, they have high exposure to predators, and obviously ground dwelling species are more subject to predation. So extinction risk goes down for Australian mammals if you're smaller than the critical weight range, and also larger than the critical weight range. Think about the large herbivores like kangaroos. They're sort of buffered from threat compared to these smaller animals. Living in stable environments, having evolved to a stable environment, is also something that features heavily within species that are on the threatened species lists. You would have heard about RMK's selection of life history traits. Sort of down one end of the continuum are the R species that have the kind of live fast, die young, sort of high reproductive rates, short lifespan, get it all done quickly, through to K-selected species that have a much slower life history strategy. And R-selected species tend to live in quite unstable or unpredictable environments, whereas K-selected species live in much more stable environments. And they adapt to those stable environments. Because they have low mortality, there's not going to be some massive environmental disaster, or they're not going to run out of food every 2 seconds. They adapt to that by having a long life. They slow their reproduction down, as in they have less young, but they do that a number of times over their lifetime. They're iteroparous. And that works because then they can produce high quality young, and they can produce lots of them over that long lifespan that they have. And often they grow to a large body size because that feeds into their ability to compete and have quality offspring. But what that means when you have evolved into this kind of fixed, slow rate of living, it means that you're unable to be flexible when environmental conditions change rapidly. And this is where species like the wandering albatross have got themselves into trouble. It's a big, big bird, has like a 2 or 3 metre wingspan, lives for a very long time, 60 years, but takes 10 to 12 years to reach maturity. And it breeds after that, but it breeds only maybe every 2 or 3 years. It lays a single egg, and if that egg gets lost or squashed or something, it doesn't relay it, it just comes back in 2 to 3 years' time, because it's got 60 years over which it can produce its young. And it breeds on subantarctic islands, and then it circumnavigates the globe basically in search for food. So that takes the sort of the local, if there's any local dips in food supply, that doesn't matter to them because they can just move on and find a new food supply. So they live in a very stable environment. Some of the populations have decreased in their survival. So mortality has dropped only by a couple of %. But in a species that's adapted to live for a long time, that makes a really huge difference to population recruitment. So a drop in adult survival rate has a really big impact on population recruitment. And at the moment, there's insufficient recruitment to maintain the breeding populations, and the IUCN predicts that there'll be a 30% decline over 70 years. Mortality has dropped because of a range of reasons, but one of them is around the long line fishing. So the birds are fishing for fish, get hooked onto the fishing line, and then of course they get dragged under the water and drowned. And so that's had an impact on populations of the wandering albatross, and there's some mitigation practices in place in some places now. And being common doesn't get you out of trouble either, unfortunately. We thought that might be a good place to be as a species, but it's often those larger species with large population sizes where they aggregate together. Those are the species that have been targeted by people and harvested by people. Buffalo in America, there were thousands, millions of those roaming the plains in America, and they were harvested almost to extinction, down to numbers of just a couple of hundred. So there's risks to species being common as well, and some authors will argue that that's perhaps where we need to keep our eyes open because common species have a big impact on an ecosystem, and if they rapidly decline, then that's going to have wide consequences for the community. Okay, so I want to now, just for the last few minutes, just talk about this current extinction crisis. And I guess from what I've said so far, rarity is normal, extinction is completely normal, and in terms of the geological history of life on Earth, and it's kind of tempting to say it's all happened before, no worries, we've got this regenerative process of speciation, the Earth will be okay. But I guess some of the things to think about that you probably have already thought about is that the species that we have vulnerable to extinction or that have become extinct in recent times have largely are that because of human-induced changes. And as I mentioned, humans have only been around for the last literally few minutes of the Earth's history. So we don't really have a precedent for that kind of an impact where humans are the inducers of change. But we can look back into the fossil record to get an idea of what things were like in terms of extinction rates before we came along. So I did mention that it's the fate of most living things to eventually go extinct. 90% of them have. And extinctions happen in what they call background time. So there's this sort of noise of ongoing extinctions that occur. And then there have been these 5 big mass extinction events that have occurred. One of them is where the dinosaurs became extinct. The other is that Permian mass extinction where 95% of all species became extinct. And mass extinctions are defined as having 60% or more of the species becoming extinct in that one event in a relatively short period of time. And by relatively short, I mean when paleontologists say that, they mean like 1 to 10 million years. And it's a global phenomenon with multiple causes. So it wasn't just the meteorite that wiped out the dinosaurs. There were other things going on, like volcanoes that were erupting for thousands of years before that. And we saw in the data that we looked at before that after those extinction events, that leads to radiations of new diversity. 96% of all of the extinctions actually happened in background times, even though those mass extinctions were so large. And background rates sit at about 1 to 5 species becoming extinct per year in the fossil record. So we need to look at how that compares to more recent extinction rates. This is some data from the last 2,000 years. So looking at bird extinctions over that period and using, again, fossil evidence to do that. And looking at bird species on Pacific islands. And it estimated that there are about 2,000 bird species that were lost in 2,000 years, about 15% of the species. So that's one species per year just for birds on the Pacific Islands. And when they did this research, they looked at those extinctions and they looked at archaeological evidence for the arrival of humans onto the islands. And in all instances, they saw that the species richness declined in a way that was associated with when humans arrived and introduced predators onto the islands. So that tells us that there's been quite a substantial, significant extinction event in birds. Looking to just the last 400 years now, this is again old data, but it shows you the basic premise, which is that there has been a really sharp increase in the extinction rate in quite recent times. And the IUCN estimates about 175 documented animal extinctions in a period of 500 years. So if you work out the extinction rate for that, it sits around 1.75, which is already at that background rate of extinctions of 1 to 5 that we mentioned before. So if we have a look at this, we look at the extinction rate for birds and mammals in the fossil record. It sits at 0.003 species per year. If current rates equaled those past rates, then that will give us 1.2 species per year in the last 400 years. And there's been 175 species of mammals and birds extinct in that time. So much, much higher than the background rate. So that kind of back of the envelope method of figuring that out has been criticised. There are some problems with it, and so people are working now towards trying to get some more accurate comparisons of fossil rates to current rates. One of the issues is that extinction rates vary depending on the length of time over which you assess them. And they know this from the fossil record. So if you look over 1 year, or you look over 1 million years, or you look over 25 million years, you'll get a different answer depending on the time frame at which you look. So it makes it quite difficult to compare what's happening over the last 400 years with what's happened over the last 500 million years in the fossil record. But it's our only way of getting that information. What you need to do is compare like with like. So we also know that extinction rates vary between taxa. So you need to compare mammals with mammals and birds with birds and not lump them together. And you need to have good knowledge of that taxon, and that's why often mammals are chosen, because as I said before, we've described most of the species, so we know most about them. Having said that, not all of those species will have been assessed by, for example, the IUCN. Okay, so what people try and do is they try and get some good estimates, and they try and estimate what their level of error or variation is. And this is the statistic that has been used, extinctions per million species years. And what that means is if one species lived for 1 million years and then became extinct, that would be 1 extinction per million species years. If it survives for longer than that time, then the value would be less than 1, the extinction rate would be lower. And if it survives for more than that time, if it survives for more than that time, then it will be less than 1, the extinction rate will be lower. And if it survives for less than that time, obviously it will be more than 1, the extinction rate will be higher. Okay, so here are some estimates for mammals. In the last 1,000 years, 24 extinctions per million species years. The average fossil rate sits at about 1.8. For very recent extinctions, in the last couple of 100 years, that sits at somewhere between 5 to 23 extinctions per million species years. These are sitting right at the top of what the error estimates would be for those mean values. If you then go and add in the critically endangered species that are listed at the moment, and you assume that they're going to become extinct in the next couple of 100 years, which is not an unreasonable assumption, then the current extinction rates become 40 to 100 times higher than the background extinction rate. Other papers more recently have looked at all vertebrates, and they get estimates of 8 to 100 times higher than background rates. One other way to look at it is to look at magnitude, because remember mass extinctions have that 60% or more species becoming extinct in that one period of time. They've actually used a boundary of 75% here. But if we compare overall losses, current losses are really quite low, sitting at about 1% for most groups. Again, if you add in species from the threatened species list and you assume that they are going to become extinct in the next couple of 100 years, then you start to get estimates that are much higher, around 20 to 30%. 43% is the realistic estimate for amphibians. So then you start to move halfway towards your mass extinction boundary, if that were to happen. And it's been noted that that may likely happen because there's been so much population decline within vertebrate species. One of the papers is calling that a biological annihilation. So the data is saying we're not quite there yet. We're not having a mass extinction just yet, but we very well could be moving into one. That's what the evidence is showing. And I guess in terms of does it really matter? Well, if we look back at the fossil record, yes, it matters because the recovery after a mass extinction takes tens of, or maybe hundreds of millions of years. And that's not a time frame that's really relevant to us as humans. There's also no precedence in the fossil record for having humans around. In those mass extinction events, yes, maybe the threat was ongoing, maybe even for 1,000 years, and then the extinctions followed for 1 million years after that. But after that episode, equilibriums come back, speciation starts to increase, and the threat's gone and the Earth starts to recover. We've got no precedent. If humans are going to stay around, we've got no precedent for what might happen with that ongoing level of threat. And I guess for me, and I'm assuming for you guys since you're here, it represents an ethical dilemma because there's quite a lot of evidence that humans are influencing the current species extinctions and population declines. So that's something that we also don't have a precedence for from Earth's history. And I just wanted to end, after all of that bad news, just with a little glimmer of hope. It's encouraging that there is still much of the world's biodiversity left to save, but daunting that doing so will require the reversal of many dire and escalating threats. So with that, good luck. I'm passing the baton to you. Enjoy your semester.